Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to this week's podcast. And the topic of this week's session is Deviant Leisure Cultures. Now, this podcast is a matching pair with the Digital Leisure Cultures session that we did last week, and we've had just unbelievable feedback in the last 7 days. We particularly want to do a shout out, if we can, to David McGilvray from the University of West Scotland, UWS. Can I say the real UWS rather than the Australian version? So big shout out, David, and thanks for the great feedback. And to the wonderful, the extraordinary, the lovely Holly Thorpe at Waikato in Hamilton and Aotearoa, New Zealand. You are an absolute legend, and it gives Steve and I incredible pleasure to see how your career is continuing to blossom and bloom, and we merely walk in your footsteps, good woman. Well, this paired podcast is very interesting to me. I'm very interested in the word deviant. Maybe that comes from my background in cultural studies, where I'm just sort of thrilled and a bit interested and a bit titillated about the odd, the alternative, the strange, and yes, the deviant. But the word deviant has some very interesting histories, some very interesting sociologies in an array of disciplines that we're going to talk about today. So, Steve, we've been talking about deviant leisure cultures for quite a while now, but I wanted this podcast to nail down this field trope concept idea for listeners. So can you tell us something about where the phrase deviant leisure cultures comes from?
Yes, deviant leisure comes from Oliver Smith, who's a reader in criminology at Plymouth University, and he's got some really good colleagues there, Thomas Raymond and other people.
Fantastic.
And Oliver set up a website called Deviant Leisure probably about a couple of years ago, which I think's been one of the best initiatives in critical criminology over the last couple of years, and he's really gathered together a really interesting deviant leisure group. But I think what is particularly interesting about this is that, as you say, we've done some recent work, particularly in podcasts and in my blogs on my personal website, say redhead.zone, around the idea of how leisure studies as a discipline is changing, particularly in the direction of what we've called digital leisure studies. But I think deviant leisure is raising the issue from the perspective of another discipline, particularly a subdiscipline, critical criminology. And that is where Oliver Smith and his colleagues come from. And the work itself, I think, is absolutely fascinating, partly because, for me, I work in both fields, if you like,
yes,
leisure studies and critical criminology. And I think this brings us together in many ways. So as the concept deviant leisure is really interesting because it's shaking up aspects of criminology and in particular critical criminology. And what the website Deviant Leisure is about, and certainly listeners should go to that website, Deviant Leisure, is the bringing together multidisciplines, law, sociology, criminology, as you mentioned, geography, computer studies and so on, in the area of looking at really how things are conceived as harm.
Yes.
And that's really where critical criminology is making a great play, in my view, and it's doing so in this field of what they call deviant leisure. And critical criminology, particularly in the ultra-realist criminology of my colleagues at the Teesside Centre for Realist Criminology at University of Teesside in the UK, people like Simon Winlow, Steve Hall and their colleagues.
The big hi, guys.
They have reconceptualised harm within criminology. And I think what Oliver and his colleagues in this Deviant Leisure research group really are starting to do is explore what it is, particularly post-global financial crisis. What is harm? What left liberal criminology in particular has done over the years, and I would include postmodern criminology within that, is that through misleading concepts like moral panic, it's allowed society to say, oh, well, crime is going down, there's no real problems. And yet, of course, at the same time, there are these huge global harms that we've talked about in the podcast before, the problems of precariousness, of problems of mental illness, poverty,
environmental damage,
absolutely, climate change and so on. So there's something wrong there, and left-liberal criminology has made massive mistakes by doing that, I think. It's played into the hands of the administrators of global capitalism. And I think what this work, particularly Deviant Leisure, is doing is really getting hold of that issue to do with harm. For example, it's looking at issues, say, like gambling.
Yes.
Okay, pornography online, sex work, drug use, parkour, free running, and so on.
Yes, you're a great free runner, aren't you, Steve?
But my ex-colleagues at University of Brighton did some really good work around parkour, and still doing that work. And I think what's interesting about those topics is that you could put in the nighttime economy in that as well, and people like Oliver Smith have done some great work, particularly around their work in York, on the nighttime economy and, the idea of the problems of getting hammered. Yeah. Now, I think the thing is that you've got harm being marginalised in some ways around these issues. So, some of the relatively harmless things are criminalised.
Yes.
And you could take, soft drug taking as one example of that.
Yeah.
Whereas the real harms, I think, post-global financial crisis, the exploitation, as you said, the environmental crises, the social crises, and so on. And I think it's particularly true since global financial crisis, and Deviant Leisure has developed since then. You've actually got those legalised.
Yeah.
And the issue, I suppose, is really what should we make criminal? What should we make harmful? Inside. And I think we've got completely the wrong end of the stick. And Deviant Leisure issues show that very nicely, I think. And that's why I think we should take our hats off to Oliver and Thomas and others at Plymouth and this whole Deviant Leisure research group. There's going to be a book out later this year, an edited collection, which I'm going to contribute to, which Oliver's editing, which hopefully will really develop this as a kind of sub-theme within critical criminology.
Yeah, and for me, I'll just add one other variable that I come to this from my particular perspective, as an historian, but also as someone who works in cultural studies, is the thing I have noticed in the last 15 years intensified after the global financial crisis is the individualisation of blame and shame and guilt.
Absolutely.
So, for example, if you think about obesity, we've talked about drug use, drug taking, alcohol, all the online folk devils as well,
Yes.
The gaming cultures that exist. But I think about how we sort of pathologise an individual body.
Yes.
So individuals taking crystal meth, individuals who, eat too much cake and dare to show their body in public. So I think what Deviant Leisure Culture does, and of course we haven't even talked about the continuum of sexualities
Yes,
as well,
very much
and
so.
how in the complicated relationship between conservatism, small c, and neoliberalism, so how the market operates with very traditional, inverted commas, family values as well, which serves to pathologise a whole array of what are called deviant leisure cultures that may be about sexual proclivities, they may be about what one is doing with one's body. So I think corporeality is quite significant here too, isn't it?
I think so. And particularly, violence to the body.
Yes.
I mean, there's some really interesting work going on in Deviant Leisure. People like Victoria Silverwood doing some really interesting work around ice hockey and violence, for example, and work, again, which cuts across aspects of things that I'm interested in entertainment and sports law. And I think you've really got some diverse interests here.
Yeah.
Multidisciplines, but also multi-areas, and they've done very well to kind of include it within this umbrella term, Deviant Leisure.
And hold it together, and it's a really strong political project, I think, but it is a political project with heritage, and I'm thinking particularly the National Deviancy Conference in the 1960s that resonated through a lot of, say, Stuart Hall's work as well. Could you draw the link between that 1960s work and what's happening now?
Yes.
Is there a link?
There is, and there's an institutional link, interestingly. Wow. So the National Deviancy Conference, which was part of, if you like, an alternative criminology in the 1960s, alternative to the traditional, what was eventually called administrative criminology, alternative criminology around the National Deviancy Conference and around the concept of deviance, which was a way of looking at harm differently in the 1960s. It actually started at York University in the UK in the 1960s, and developed, really through the decade, through the late 60s and into the 70s to the late 70s. It still had a power, but it was revived again at York University in the UK in 2011 when we just left for Canada.
Yes. And
basically, that was a very successful, revived National Deviancy Conference. And there was another one at Teesside, as a result of the Teesside Centre for Real-Estate Criminology putting on a wonderful conference in 2014. Yeah. So there's definitely a real impetus around this aspect of critical criminology. And, there are physical connections. People like Oliver Smith, who working at Plymouth now, did some wonderful work on the nighttime economy in the York area. York, UK. So I think there's no doubt that there is a connection here, but also that the idea, so there's an institutional connection and a historical connection that you've pointed to, but I think it's also, as we've talked about in these other podcasts, disciplines are now starting to, particularly since the global financial crisis, have started to really re-examine themselves, to splinter off, to make connections. So, as we've said before, leisure studies is starting to really look hard at itself. Criminology is also looking hard at itself, and Deviant Leisure brings a bridge between those two that are both looking at themselves very hard, looking for new theories, for new ways of connecting with what I think are really tectonic shifts globally that we've really not got hold of. These scholars are starting to get hold of it.
And I find that so incredibly inspiring, because with all the stuff that's going on at the moment, not only in the UK and in the US, but also in Australia, about what is the point of a university, and having the university at service of small and medium-sized enterprises. How can you commercialise this research in the next 3.5 minutes? Yep. I find it really powerful, provocative, and so incredibly inspiring, Steve, that we've got all these colleagues around the world who are joining together to solve real, actual problems.
Absolutely.
Rather than invented micro-traumas that, these tears in the neoliberal landscape.
Yeah.
Very powerful.
It's fantastic to see, and I really think, personally I want to congratulate a lot of these people. I've learnt so much, been inspired by these people, and that people are working in fragments. And that's the interesting thing, that, as we've said before in this podcast, that social media and other forms of connection are actually making a critical mass out of this, which is great.
It's fantastic. And therefore, let's engage with that disciplinary issue. So, is there disciplinary power to deviant leisure cultures? We've talked a lot about interdisciplinarity. A lot of the institutions, particularly the national structures for research, are working actively against interdisciplinarity. So is there some sort of disciplinary power in this phrase, deviant leisure cultures?
I think there is, and as this Oliver's edited book comes out, and we get the kind of disciplinary power that we got a few years ago within criminology around, say, cultural criminology.
Yes.
Keith Hayward and his colleagues at the University of Kent made fantastic inroads into a sub-discipline of critical criminology. I think the same thing will happen with Deviant Leisure. I think the publisher of that edited collection will push it in that way. But I think what's happening, particularly around critical criminology, which again is a sub-discipline of criminology in general, but really quite powerful disciplinary trope, and I think that's really what you're asking. The areas, again, institutionally, the British Society of Criminology has now a critical criminology network. The Australian and New Zealand Critical Criminology group is having its 10th annual conference this year. There are some really good movements in Australia. Kerry Carrington and her QUT colleagues, for example. Lots of other really interesting work going on. There's a division on critical criminology in the American Society of Criminology, which we were involved in at UIT when we were professors in Canada. And I think I'd say institutionally that's interesting. That a bit like the NDC, the National Deviancy Conference in the late 1960s in the UK, there's an institutional basis to this. There's a real enthusiasm, particularly amongst younger scholars. And they're good, younger, critical scholars who are not embedded in the conservatism of the universities. And I think that's, in a funny sort of way, we're back in the late 1960s.
Well, let's hope we are, because the music was pretty good as well, and we should actually log the death of David Bowie, speaking of the late 1960s.
We certainly should.
If we're talking about Deviant Leisure Culture,
wasn't he an emblem?
He was right in the middle of it. We watched Ziggy Stardust of the Spiders from Mars last night, and Deviant Leisure Culture
absolutely
was sitting before us. I saw things I never thought I would see, and again, we haven't since. So the late 1960s has a lot to offer, and you've already raised and talked about, Steve, the importance of younger scholars here, and I know a lot of postgraduates, a lot of master's students listen to these podcasts because so many contact us, but how can deviant leisure culture as a trope, as a field, be used by these emerging scholars, and particularly postgraduates? So I'm thinking about a master's student who may be considering an area for a doctorate, for example. Yep. Do you recommend this as an area to go into? Has it got momentum and trajectory?
I really do, yes I do. And it's interesting that if people go on the Deviant Leisure website of Oliver Smith and other colleagues, there's call for postgraduate students to do work in such sorts of areas. And I think that's particularly happening in both the critical criminology area and the leisure studies area that we've been talking about in recent weeks. I think there's in both those areas great potential for postgraduate students, for master's students and so on, to do some work, some really good, really groundbreaking work in these areas. I think the interesting thing is that partly because there is a history and tradition that we've talked about, the National Deviancy Conference here, but for a long time, particularly in criminology, postgraduate work was in the more conservative areas, both theoretically and empirically. I think the groundbreaking work that has been done, say in the nighttime economy by people like Oliver Smith, Simon Winlow and his colleagues at Teesside, and we did our work earlier on in the 90s in the Manchester Institute for Popular Culture around that area. I think that's now got a tradition, it's got a history. So postgraduate students can come in and do some really good new work in this interdisciplinary area. Deviant Leisure is a great example of where postgraduates can get a foothold.
Absolutely, and from my sort of perspective, why I'm enjoying it is it's moving freely between analogue and digital, body and context, and all the arbitrary barriers that were put in place. This is real life, this is digital life. In this paradigm, all of that's gone. So you can research as much the 24-hour city as look at the deep, dark web and the connectivity between them all. So this is a powerful area, and these connections are going to matter.
And there are going to be real developments in this area. I mean, there's a sub-area of this is actually called dark leisure, which is partly about nighttime economy and so on. There's a conference that Carl Sprackler and his colleagues are organising on dark leisure this year at Leeds Beckett, for example. Again, asking for postgrad students to be involved. So I think they'll really watch this space. This is an area that's really going to take off, I think.